Welcome back to the channel, y'all. If you've never been here before, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, please. Click the bell next to the subscribe button so you're notified every time a new video goes up on SouFLoTV. Without further ado, let's get right into this. I don't know, pull up a chair, fix a drink, roll up a spliff, do something, but sit in for a minute because this one is going to be lengthy. We've been keeping up with the Klansman Gang trial, which includes the infamous individual known as Tesha Miller, who Jamaica law enforcement officials say is the leader of one faction of the Klansman Gang. The notorious Klansman Gang is one of the two most notorious gangs out of Jamaica. No disrespect to all the other gangs and their names, but when people say clans and when people say one order, that is something that is set in stone. It is also alleged that these two gangs rose to power and prominence through their affiliation with political parties and people in positions of power. So, it is all intertwined. Now, the last video we did, we basically went into the courtroom and saw what was going on and heard testimonies that are quite interesting. This one is no different. We'll start out by saying, the defense in the ongoing trial of 25 suspected members of the alleged Tesha Miller faction of the Klansman Gang on Friday failed spectacularly in their bid to discredit a prosecution witness whom they accused of recently fabricating evidence he gave in the matter on Thursday. Questioning is happening. May I remind the audience listening that this case is like the USA version of a RICO trial. A RICO trial is something that they use, or a RICO charge is something that they use to bring down like the mafia. Actually, that is who it was intended for in its origin. And then, of course, now for gangs, organizations, criminal organizations, so multiple individuals are normally involved. In this particular case, according to the Jamaica law enforcement, they have 25 individuals who are suspected to be members of the gang. Let's not forget, they're all on trial, they're all pleading not guilty, and they're all fighting the case in court. So, the forensic crime scene investigator who processed the scene of September 2017 murder allegedly committed by two of the defendants had testified that on the day in question, he was sent to the Roger Avenue area of Spanish Town in St. Catherine, where he saw a motor car with what appeared to be bullet holes in the front windscreen and a pivot glass, blood smeared on the left passenger door of the vehicle. Spent casings were on the ground beside that vehicle, and what appeared to be a pool of blood at the front of the vehicle, plus a discarded pair of brown slippers. In giving the chain of custody for the items from the scene, the sleuth, a detective corporal, said that after processing the area, which had been cordoned off, he processed and proceeded to Spanish Town Hospital, where the body of a male with a Rastafarian hairstyle or a head full of dreadlocks, and with what appeared to be bullet wounds to the upper chest area, was shown to him. Somebody said, "Come, see the body here." He said that after photographing the body, it was tagged by morgue attendants, after which he placed it in a white bag, he sealed it, he initialed the seal, and he photographed same before handing it over. This is him talking about the chain of custody and how he gathered the evidence and how the evidence was sealed up and how it was presented to be preserved for this day when it would be used for trial. Defendants Dwayne Frater and Lamar Rowe, according to the incident or the indictment unsealed by the Crown last Wednesday, when the trial began in the Home Circuit Division of the Supreme Court in downtown Kingston, they are to answer for the murder of that man who has been identified as George Richards. So, Dwayne Frater and Lamar Rowe are being held responsible for the murder of George Richards. Frater and Lamar, under count 7 of the indictment, they are charged with facilitating the commission of a serious offense by a criminal organization, contrary to Section 6 of the Criminal Justice Suppression of Criminal Organization Act, or this is Jamaica's version of the R.I.C.O, commonly known as the anti-gang legislation. So, Friday morning, when the hearing started again, before Supreme Court Judge Justice Dale Palmer, defense attorney Javed Grant launched the first broadside against the detective corporal. This is a detective corporal who is on the stand. He is being cross-examined and questioned, and he is holding his own. You would agree with me that you know how to write a statement and that you prepared a statement in relation to this incident on the 16th of September 2017. And at the end of the statement, you signed it to be true to the best of your knowledge. This is what the attorney said to the cop that was on the stand. The corporal responded affirmatively and said yes. And when questioned further, the cop said that he had written the statement a couple days after. Grant, in pointing out that the detective had taken photos and even produced a sketch of the scene in support of his statement, was at pains to point out that the cop, in his detailed statement, made no mention of a container, but only did so when he took the stand for the first time on Thursday. What the lawyer is trying to point out is the police is saying stuff that is not even in his written statement. You were at the scene, everything you saw you wrote down, and you sealed that up, and that is what's being used as evidence. And now, at last minute, while you're on the stand, you're suddenly remembering all kinds of new things since 2017, and we are in 2026. Which one is more accurate? Wouldn't it be what you wrote down while you were at the scene and the pictures that you took to corroborate what you saw and wrote? Not this new stuff that you're adding in and mentioning now in 2026. Officer, yesterday in your examination in chief, you spoke of observing a container on the crime scene. Would it surprise you to know that in the statement that you gave in relation to this matter, and you signed it to be true to the best of your knowledge and belief, there is no reference to any container in your original statement? This is what the attorney said. Would it surprise you, sir, that in none of the photographs that were shown and you identified the different portions, there was no container pointed out? Would it surprise you, sir, that not even in the sketch that you made was any container present? This attorney was beating the brakes off this police officer who was on the stand. In response to the cop's reply in the negative, because the cop kept saying no, no, no to all the queries that the attorney said. The attorney then said, my first suggestion, you see, is that your reference to you having obtained a container on September 16th of 2017 is just a recent fabrication. I am also suggesting that there is nothing, whether in your statement or in the pictures or in the sketch, to support any presence of this container on that day. The cop still answered and said, I disagree. Now, mind you, the attorney has a point. Nothing in your pictures says container was there. Nothing in your writing, nothing in your sketch that says container was there, but you're out saying out your mouth that container was there. Which one should we go off of? So when the cop further admitted that he had not, in fact, pointed out a container in the photos or in the sketch which had been shown to him, Grant, the attorney, ended his interrogation and said, I suggest to you that your mention of a container is make that up. Make it up. Is somebody tell you to mention that container? That is why you come in here to the convention container. Damn. Continue where Grant left off now. Defense attorney Tamika Harris, another attorney who is representing Lamar Rowe, charged that the reason that the cop made no mention of the container in his original statement but referenced it while giving evidence in court on the stand was because his colleagues at the Major Investigation Division, who were also involved in the case, they are the ones that put him up to it. You did a briefing and they told you to mention the container, which is why you mentioned it in the first thing when you came here. A container that was nowhere in your statement at all in 2017. Harris, the next attorney to cross-examine the police officer, leaned in and said, an acting deputy director of public prosecution who had voiced strong objections to Grant's line of questioning. Grant is the attorney who was questioning the DPP public prosecution, who voiced strong objection to Grant's line of questioning in re-examining the witness, recalled the compact disc with the photos that was entered as an exhibit in the case on Thursday and pointed to 2 slides in which the disputed container was clearly displayed. Not only was it suggested that it was a recent fabrication, but it was also put to him that the container was nowhere in the images that he took. Counsel, saying he was put in the context of the picture, which were shown, doesn't take it any higher, my lord. It is my friend who has placed it squarely on the table that there is no container, which is precisely the reason for re-examination, the senior prosecutor stated. Now, stating that he was going the extra mile to revisit more than one photo for the tribunal, the prosecutor said that this was because it was being insisted by the defense that the mention of the container was a recent fabrication. Them make that up. Them take new pictures of container in the area. There was none there, because there was none when this police officer in 2017 took all his pictures and even sat there and did a sketch of the scene. How come him never sketching containers? He didn't write about it in his written statement. It doesn't show up in his pictures. The prosecution is yet to lead any evidence indicating the circumstances surrounding that murder and the alleged involvement of the 2 defendants named in respect of that count. So what it's looking like here in the audience, it's looking like the police officers are trying to frame some people and botch the scene so they can get a guilty verdict. You understand? And these defense attorneys are chopping away at their feet. The detective corporal, who on Friday finished giving his evidence, is the prosecutor's 4th witness. The matter resumes Monday at 10 a.m. before Justice Palmer, who is hearing the evidence sitting alone. The 25 accused, the second faction of the gang, is now be tried by the courts are to answer to 16 offenses allegedly committed over the span of 5 years between August 2017 and November of 2022, according to the case being built by the Crown. This is a trial by judge only. Last Wednesday, during arraignment of the alleged gang boss Tesha Miller and his 24 co-accused, all of them, 25 of them, pleaded not guilty to all counts with which they have been charged, including the second count of the indictment, on which they are all charged with the offense of being part of a criminal organization. Now, you must remember also that Tesha Miller, in a separate case, has already been tried and convicted and was given a life sentence already, and is currently serving that life sentence, but also he is appealing that life sentence. Therefore, he will be before the courts for a while. So although he is serving that life sentence, they are looking to bury him under a prison that is under the regular prison, because that is what's going to happen if he is tried and convicted in this case as well, right? So now they're up, and here we are before the courts again. We're following the trail. Stay with us. Now, it gets rather interesting. Murders unsolved until gang insiders started talking to the police and decided to turn witnesses. On the last video we did, we told you that this case starts to get very interesting because we covered the Klansman Gang trial, but the one done faction of the Klansman Gang trial in previous time gone by. For those of you who don't know it, it is said by law enforcement in Jamaica. And I say it is said by them because it can't be said by me, SouFLoTV, because I don't know. It is said by law enforcement in Jamaica that the Klansman Gang was one gang. And at some point there was a discrepancy, inside fighting, and then there was a split of the gang. You had one man whose name was Black Man, and Black Man decided to form his own faction of the Klansman Gang, and that faction is called the One Done Gang. Klansman One Done Gang, led by Andre Blackman. That's the one that went on trial before this. It is said that some of the members left and they went with Blackman and formed his faction, the Blackman, the One Done faction. The other faction remained was the Tesha Miller Klansman Gang. So now we are covering the Tesha Miller part. Andre Blackman had already been found guilty and had already been given a life sentence. And now here we are looking at the Tesha Miller faction of the Klansman Gang as they go to trial as well. Boy, easy for get in trouble, you know. Hard to get out. So whether you do it or not, once you get caught up with the law, good luck. He went on to say that a 34-year veteran of the Jamaica Constabulary Force who led the investigation into a September 2017 murder at Roger Avenue in St. Catherine, in which two of the defendants in the ongoing trial of 25 suspected members of the alleged Tesha Miller faction of the Klansman Gang are allegedly involved, on Monday told the courts that despite receiving eyewitness accounts, he was never able to pinpoint a suspect. Defendant Dwayne Frater and Lamar Rowe, according to the indictment unsealed by the Crown on February 4th, when the trial began in the Home Circuit Division of the Supreme Court in downtown Kingston, they are to answer to the murder of that man who had been identified as George Richards. Frater and Lamar, under count 7 of the indictment, are charged with facilitating the commission of serious offense by criminal investigations organization contrary to Section 6 of the Criminal Justice Suppression of Criminal Organization Act, commonly known as the anti-gang legislation. Again, the admission of the self-styled sleuth, a detective inspector assigned to the Constabulary Major Investigation Division, or the MID, harks back to indications by the Crown in its opening address that the evidence of its 2 star witnesses, who are yet to be unveiled, helped the cops to crack the majority of the 16 crimes which had remained unsolved for some 7 to 8 years, for which their former cronies are now on trial. Broken down in layman's terms for everybody who's listening, 2 of the man them, according to the police, 2 of the members of the Klansman Gang have decided to turn state's witness. And it is because of them and their inside information that they are giving. They are snitching so much that they have been able to solve 16 crimes, including multiple murders and racketeering and other extortion cases, etc., 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 because them a tell everything. So that is what the detective is here in court saying. But they have not unveiled these 2 insiders yet. Well, the acting deputy director of public prosecution, following the arraignment of the 25, had said that the 2 ex-gangsters turned star witnesses, they already pled guilty to varying offenses, including murder, and they are currently serving their sentences already. Merited. And nobody don't know who they are. Very interesting. The senior prosecutor, in urging presiding Judge Justice Dale Palmer to accept the evidence of the 2, said, until these 2 witnesses were found, or until they assisted the Crown, the large majority of these 16 incidents were unsolved, Your Honor. These were unsolved cases with no suspects. The significance of these principal witnesses is underscored by their own involvement in these previously unsolved cases. In short, until the police became aware of these witnesses, there were no charged suspects in some of these cases for as long as 7 to 8 years. Once we got in touch with these witnesses and they started talking to us, everything started adding up and making sense. Why? On Monday, the detective inspector who said in 2017 that he was the team supervisor on the case, he testified that he commenced murder investigation in 2017. He at no time had any suspect in relation to the crime. That means this was a faceless murder and nobody knew or had a clue who did what. No, sir, I did not identify the suspect, he told the acting deputy director of public prosecution, eliciting the evidence. Later, on the cross-examination by defense attorney Kamar Robinson as to whether he had identified possible witnesses, the veteran cop said, yes, sir, and more than one too. Probed as to whether he had identified any possible suspects, he maintained, I did not identify suspects. I have not identified a suspect until this day. I'm going to suggest that when you said that you did not identify any subjects, you are not telling the truth, Robinson said. I disagree with you vehemently, the cop stated, unblinkingly. Just to clear things up, did you identify possible suspects though? Robinson asked again, backtracking. The cop then said, yes, possible suspects. What? Ask if he had made these up on his own. The attorney said, you met these suspects up on your own. The cop said, no. The cop said first he had not identified any suspects. Now he said he did identify possible suspects. Probed further by the attorney about whether the names that he had written on overleaf in his notebook, where he had written about the Roger Avenue crime scene under the heading Possible Suspects, were that related to the case. The cop, after several checks, maintained that those names were for an unrelated matter. So under further questioning by defense attorney Denise Hinson on the same issue, the cop who said he remained lead investigator up to 2018, he responded and said, I did not identify any suspects. He, in the meantime, testified that on the night in question, he made several observations. Upon getting to the scene where he counted about 13 spent shells and a vehicle with what appeared to be bullet holes, as well as a lot of bloodstains on the roadway and a pair of flip-flops, elaborating on the location of those spent shells, he said, well, some of them were close to the vehicle, as if someone was shot right beside the vehicle. However, although he referenced the pair of footwear, the slippers, when it came time to say where in the photo displayed to him that those slippers were, the detective inspector initially struggled to point them out, confessing that on Valentine's Day, he got an injury to his left eye, which affected his ability to see, provoking much mirth from those in the courtroom. People in the courtroom started laughing because the detective could not point out a certain evidence in the pictures, and then the detective draw for an excuse and said he recently had an injury to his eye, so he can't really see the picture them. People in the courtroom started murmuring and giggling. His testimony came following that of a detective sergeant who was assigned to the MID unit earlier on Monday. The testimony of the detective sergeant, a forensic scene investigator, helped the Crown to shore up its case regarding the chain of custody, sequential documentation or trial that accounts for the sequence of custody control, transfer, analysis, and deposition of evidence from that crime scene. That is what we talked about before this, where the chain of custody was explained, and yet still he, even though he took pictures, even though he hand sketched the scene to support his handwritten, also verbalized words on paper of the scene, there was no mention of the container that he is now mentioning in court. That's the detective that testified before this detective. The detective sergeant told the court that on October 2017, he was at Archer's funeral home in Spanish Town, St. Catherine, where he observed the post-mortem conduct of the body of Richards, whose remains were identified by a relative. He said that the body had several wounds to the face and to the upper torso area. He told the courts that blood, damaged copper jacket bullets, and 2 pieces of lead were removed from the body by a government pathologist, and they were packaged and they were sealed and they were transported by him to the MID, where they were logged and they were placed in the exhibit storeroom to be transported to the government's forensics lab. He said on a later day, he collected the items and he took them to the lab, where he handed the package, personally handed it over, containing the blood, to an analysis at the biology department, and he was given a receipt. He said the other package was handed over to the ballistics department and a receipt was also given then. Again, 25 men are accused, 24 including Tesha Miller, making 25. The second faction of the gang is now be tried by the courts, are to answer to 16 offenses that they had allegedly committed in the years spanning a 5-year period between 2017 November and 2022, according to the paperwork for this case. And again, please remember that Tesha Miller is currently in prison serving time already, but he's not just serving time, he's actually appealing his sentence as we speak. So even that is going to be before the courts in days to come, right? Now, they further went on to say that a ruling was expected. The continuation of the Klansman Gang trial is expected to settle keenly contested issues surrounding ballistics evidence. It was one of the points over which the defense and the prosecution vigorously sparred once again during the latest session on Tuesday. It is now up to the Supreme Court Judge Justice Dale Palmer to rule on whether the courts will accept an application by the Crown in the ongoing trial of 25 suspected members of the alleged Tesha Miller faction of the Klansman Gang to have 10 ballistic certificates relating to gun crimes supposedly carried out by these accused men, tendered and admitted into evidence. So the judge will now have to decide if these certificates are going to be entered into evidence or not. So at the start of the trial on Wednesday, February 4th, the prosecution had made the application regarding notice that was served by it on the defense pursuant to Section 46A of the Firearms Act of 1967 relating to incidents to which the ballistic certificates are linked. At that time, oral objections were raised by the defense, and a written objection later filed by attorney John Clark, who represents alleged gang leader Tesha Miller. John Clark himself, a very popular attorney. John Clark himself worked alongside Isaac Buchanan, if I'm not mistaken, to free Vybz Kartel and the rest of the Mandem. On Tuesday, an acting deputy director of public prosecution who had been leading the evidence and renewed application indicated that the notices were prepared, they were filed, and they were signed on January 27th of 2026 and disclosed on the defense the same day. This was 3 clear days before the trial commenced, as required under Section 46A of the Firearms Act 1967, which was still in force at the time. I took note and so submit that having regard to the provisions of Section 46A, once it is that the Crown complies with the time requirement from that section, in the language of the statute, the document which are attached to the notice shall be tendered and admitted into evidence. I don't wish to try or even attempt to lecture in respect to that particular term. Suffice it is to say that it is trite and the term shall has been judicially accepted to mean mandatory. In this case, having complied with the preconditions and the time requirement, we are submitting that the documents ought to be tendered and admitted into evidence, the senior prosecutor urged. In referencing two written objections filed by Clark, the attorney, the defense attorney, the senior prosecutor pointed out that the first title notice of objection is dated the 5th of February 2026, but it was filed on the 10th day of February 2026, which was approximately 6 days after the commencement of the trial and approximately 10 days plus after the documents were served on the defense. The notices, certainly the first one, because the second title notice of objection is to any and all notices to come issued by the Crown. I simply submit that I don't believe that is a notice known to the law, and it's not one which is proper in any event. One can't object to what is not even placed before the courts, the senior prosecutor contended. Bear with me with this one. This will be over soon. This is a lot of law jargon and a lot of what is going on behind the scenes. In this particular scene right here, you have prosecution trying to get the judge to accept these 10 certificates for ballistic evidence into the courts as evidence that will be used in the case. And you have the defense attorneys who are defending the alleged gangsters. They are arguing back with the prosecution, and there's a lot of law jargon being used. So, speaking further on the notice, which was filed on behalf of defendants Tesha Miller, Jermaine Hall, Sean Gilzine, Conroy Cadogan, and Kamar Miller, the prosecutor was even more forceful, arguing, in respect to the notice, it is certainly out of time and ought not to prevent your lordship from allowing the documents to be tendered and admitted into evidence. So the DPP is basically saying to the judge that John Clark and the other defense attorneys, they filed their objections to have these certificates admitted, but they filed it too late. And according to the law, the statutes, there is a time limit in which you could file the objection, and their objections seem to have been filed way after, which means it shouldn't stop the judge from accepting everything into evidence. All right? However, in her submission, defense attorney Denise Hinson said that the notices were improperly served, and that's the reason why they were filed late. The notices were served under Section 46 of the old Firearm Act. Some of the reports were prepared subsequent to the repealing of the act, and the men were charged subsequent to the repealing of that act. The men are being prosecuted under the Criminal Justice Suppression of Criminal Organizations Act. It is our submission that the notices were improperly given under the old Firearms Act, which had been repealed, and so the 3 clear days requirement under that act do not apply under this new act. That is the thrust of our submission, the attorney argued. Oh, because remember, Jamaica recently revamped its gun laws. The prosecutor, however, was at plain pain to point out that the new legislation, the Firearm Prohibition, Restriction and Regulation Act of 2022, came into effect November 1st of 2022. The currency of that act is from 2022 onwards. It does not have retrospective effect. The indictment which has been preferred in this matter, which the Crown is proceeding on, speaks to incidents between August of 2017 through to September of 2022. In those circumstances, the appropriate act in relation to firearms and any material touching and concerning ballistic reports in the Firearm Act of 1967, which has currency from that date up to when it was repealed, he said. But Hinson, in doggedly holding on, further argued that the Crown has not been compliant with the case management order made prior to this trial, in particular where it concerns disclosure. The protocols have not been followed. It's a bit unfortunate that the Crown is holding so firm on its position and arguing the court to proceed to its application, which itself has not complied with the directions clearly set out to show disclosure ought to be done, she said, while maintaining that the section of the Act being relied on does not contemplate serving documents electronically. In support of the submission, defense attorney Tamika Harris pointed out that the legislation says notice must be served on the accused personally, not electronically. So while service on the counsel through electronic means may be acceptable in the civil arena, I am suggesting in light of the fact that counsel is in court from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. The accused are in court from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. most days and are taken back to where they are housed after. They would not get the opportunity to see these documents and give us instructions. So realistically, serving us electronically does not compute to serving the accused men in 3 days. Defense attorney John Clark carried the point even further, and he said, "We have a Firearms Act which imposes an obligation on the courts to serve a written notice and specifically upon the person who is charged." That elicited a swift remark from the sitting judge. "So, on whose behalf are you addressing me now, counsel?" is what the judge said. "Is it on your own behalf or on behalf of someone? Because if that is to follow, I wonder about the standing of counsel at all. Because if service on counsel is not service on the accused, then could submissions made by counsel be those of the accused?" Justice Parker, the judge, asked the attorney John Clark. The legal sparring now intensified in the courtroom. That is a very pointed question. But as the court appreciates when we speak about interpretation, then specific legislation of Parliament indicates to the court the manner in which certain things are done. We would humbly submit that unless that specific legislation expressively explains, Clark, a brilliant attorney, replied. Justice Palmer was very much up to the challenge though. So the Justice Palmer, the judge, says, if what counsel is saying is so, the way we have practiced law all over the world must now change. Because is it that counsel is now saying that service of any document on counsel is not service on the accused person? Don't get me wrong. I understand your submission. I'm just saying, I would love to have the benefit of any legal authority anywhere that supports that position, because the same position has been articulated repeatedly this afternoon. So we have gone over that submission. John Clark now, in responding, the judge and John Clark are sparring back and forth here. Now, here is John Clark. In responding, he suggested that the court consult the law books and form its own opinions. But he was clear that his views on the matter is as stands. The attorney sent the judge gone back in the law book, This could sometimes backfire if the judge is going to be taking it personal. But if the judge is unbiased and in pursuit of true justice, then the judge will simply revert back to the law books. After all, not because you're a judge don't mean you know everything, and because you know everything don't mean you can remember everything when required to remember. So that's why they have those books. Clark, in responding, suggested that the courts, meaning the judge and their assistant, consult the law books, but stood firmly on what he said. The court will have to look within the legislation itself to answer the specific question. We will humbly submit that Section 46 does not contemplate electronic service. We have Parliament indicating that this notice must be served in a certain manner. According to Clark, if the court oversteps this directive, it opens the door for grounds for the accused to argue in an appeal that they did not see those notices. This alone could get a case thrown out later on appeal or a conviction overturned. That interpretation, the logical conclusion to that argument is that the objection which was filed by counsel, Mr. Clark, ought to have been prepared and filed by the accused himself. That interpretation leads to significant absurdity, is what the senior prosecutor retorted. So now they're going back and forth again. Justice Palmer is to rule on the application when the matter resumes in court. Bear with it, I told y'all that this was going to be a pretty lengthy one. If your spliff done, go and go roll up a next one. Don't get too high though, because you want to hear what go on. Fix a sandwich or something then. Or grab a cup of tea. Pull up a chair, because we have quite a bit more to go. Alright? So, with that said, we are going to dive into another piece now. We have about 3 more pieces to go. And let's start out with this one. The judge demands scientific experts for gun crimes. Yes. Supreme Court Judge Justice Dale Palmer ruled that the prosecution in the ongoing trial of 25 suspected members of the alleged Tesha Miller faction of the Klansman Gang will have to bring expert witnesses in order for the 10 ballistic certificates relating to gun crimes supposedly committed by the accused to be tendered and admitted into evidence. If the prosecution cannot bring experts, ballistic experts, expert witnesses rather, then those probably will be thrown out. Here's the details. This follows on an application by the Crown, right? At the start of the trial on February 4th to have the certificates tendered and admitted into evidence by way of notices which were served on the defense pursuant to Section 46A of the Firearm Act of 1967, which was repealed in 2022 and changed to something else. At the time, oral objections were raised by defense and 2 written objections later filed by attorney John Clark, who represents Tesha Miller, the infamous Tesha Miller. According to the defense, not only were the notices improperly served, but the accused, should the court accept the application in its present form, the accused would be robbed of the opportunity to object and to have the experts made available for cross-examination by their attorneys. An acting Deputy Director of Public Prosecution had countered that argument that objection had been filed late and that as such were certainly out of time and ought not to prevent your lordship or the judge from allowing these documents to be tendered and admitted into evidence. However, Justice Palmer, in now settling the matter, when the trial resumed on Thursday morning in the Home Circuit Division of the Supreme Court in downtown Kingston, said, while the clear spirit of the legislation is to allow the Crown, where there is no objection, to tender that which otherwise would be a hearsay document into evidence for the truth of its contents, the spirit of the statute also extends, in his view, to the ability to object in writing before it is tendered. There's no question in my mind that a valid notice has been served on the defendant, and save for the fact of the corresponding objections notices being filed and served late, in that they were served after the start of the proceedings, there appears to be no real issue taken to the objection as filed, the justice said. He said that while the general objection filed by Clark was invalid, the other objections, though served after the stipulated time, if one is to keep the spirit and tenor of the legislation, which is to allow the defendant to object, is, in his view, very valid. The certifications were served as required, is admitted into evidence without the need to call the expert, subject to the defendant's right to object. And in my view, that right to object should not be deprived where it is filed out of time, Justice Palmer explained. So the expert jurists, however, acknowledged that while it is inconvenient to have all 10 certificates of any number of certificates put into evidence separately, as valuable time will be needed to be utilized in the trial that has some significant way to go, said the law accepts nothing less. If the legislation explicitly says that every defendant may object, and the sole issue is that it is done out of time, but still insufficient time to give the Crown and the court sufficient notice of the desire to object, I believe that they ought to be allowed to take their objections. And it does not bear some similarities to the authority or case law relied on by the court's Crown that says, conversely, that the Crown served a notice late, but in significant time to allow them well advanced notice of their intention to tender it. Then no prejudice is done. So similarly to objections taken, even if the result is inconvenient, they should not be denied. I rule, therefore, the judge says, that a valid objection has been filed and that the experts should be made available to be examined. Oh shit. Oh shit. So John Clark, a brilliant attorney like I told y'all before, just scored a big win right there, with the judge ruling in his favor that his objection letter is valid and that experts should be made available to be cross-examined. That said, the judge said, I believe, should it be that the Crown is able to show that one of the other expectations of the hearsay rules, specifically under the Evidence Act, are met, or any other legislation for that matter, they may apply at some other stage in relation to the certificates, of course, to establish that the exception has been made, he stated further. He, in the meantime, rapped the defense for its stubborn stance on agreeing evidence in the matter, facts, documents, or testimony, that all parties in criminal proceedings accept as true, meaning these facts do not need to be formally proven in court, and physically witnesses do not have to take the stand, saving judicial time. Something that I've observed since the commencement of this matter is a refusal of any counsel to agree anything in this case, in a matter that still has some 90 odd remaining witnesses to be called. That means this case is going to be very, very long. I asked the question, what is the point of insisting in all witnesses attending in person where there is no challenge to the evidence this particular witness is to give? Is what the judge asks. Obviously, the judge is trying to wrap up this drawn out thing from being further drawn out. So far, as I've seen, even in these objections, no ground has been stated as to the reason. And I acknowledge the law doesn't require that any ground is stated, but why insist when there is no dispute on these issues? And I ask this rhetorically. We need to get to the place where we have an in-issue focused approach to hearing these matters. Is any more justice done by insisting that we sit until the end of the year? Insisting that every witness come to say, I took an item from this person to hand to the analysis to be analyzed where you have not taken issue? Noting that in several instances since the trial started, witnesses have been called, that not one question is asked of this witness. Justice Palmer said, I invite all counsel to remember that as we take the time of whatever period of the remainder of the year that is needed to hear this matter, this case, that there, as I have indicated, therefore, there's a cost to it. And the matter continues. So what the judge is basically saying after the judge decided that John Clark, the attorney, is right, his objection is valid, and the prosecution must present expert witnesses in order for the 10 ballistic certificates relating to the gun crimes supposedly committed by the accused to be actually admitted into evidence. While we're saying all that, the judge is also saying that, listen, I realize that both parties are very much not working together. So obviously, this is going to take a long time with 90 witnesses left to be called. 90. And everybody's suggesting that each and every one of these witnesses must take the stand to testify. Please remember that if you draw this out, because what I'm seeing is witnesses are being called and what they're being asked really is not a point of contention, and their testimonies do not change anything. So he's basically trying to tell them to narrow down the witness pool so that this case could be over faster. But a judge can't really say, hurry up and finish the case, because that right there could be a point of contention if someone is found guilty when they take this all the way to the Supreme Court, the Privy Council, or, the highest court, which is the Privy Council, or before they get to that. If you are not given opportunities that are provided in the law, and if a judge rush your case like, man, hurry up with the case, I want to go home to dinner, or I'm taking my family out this weekend to the North Coast, we're taking the boat out to sail, I don't have time for this, hurry up and finish it quick. Cut the 90 witnesses to 45, make it quicker. Judge can't really do that. So in a slick way, the judge is kind of saying to them, hey, remember I said this costs money, And we learned from the Vybz Kartel case how much money these types of cases can cost. We learned in pounds, British pounds, how much these kinds of cases can cost. So, here's another piece now about a man who was killed while making soup deliveries. And these stories get pretty intense and interesting. I told you, hold on to the boring parts because the exciting parts are there. Rest in peace to those who lost their lives during this, and may justice be served. We don't have any dog in this fight. We're just reporting from the outside, and that's what we do. Emotions ran high in the courtroom. Number 1 of the Home Circuit Court in downtown Kingston on Thursday, when a relative of George Richards, a man allegedly murdered at the hands of 2 defendants in the ongoing trial of 25 suspected members of the alleged Tesha Miller faction of the Klansman Gang, testified that the next time she saw him was over a month later when she closed his eyes while he lay on the autopsy table. His eyes were still open and she closed his eyes for him. Richards was killed while in the process of making a soup delivery. The somber relative, who was the one to identify his body ahead of the autopsy on October 11th of 2017, covered her face briefly before bravely continuing. She was a bit scared. She covered her face. She's in mourning as well for her beloved family member. She said, "They showed me him, and I went and I looked at him, and I see say it's him, and I closed his eyes because him eyes them did wide open." She said on the night of September 16th, 2017, Richards, who is a tiler by profession, had been busy making soup. And he was there selling his soup as well, a little hustle on the side, until he got a call to make a delivery. She told the courts that it was not long after that she got wind of his demise, after he got the call to deliver the soup. The distraught relative, who fought to compose herself because she was crying on the stand, dabbing at her eyes with a rag in order to finish her testimony, she described how she sometimes later went to his crime scene, where she saw the pair of brown slippers that he was wearing that night, and they were just discarded on the ground. That was left at the scene. Softly, she told the prosecutors leading the evidence that this was all she could remember of the scene that greeted her that night was his slippers laying on the concrete. Defendants Dwayne Frater and Lamar Rowe, according to the indictment unsealed by the Crown on February 4th when the trial began, are the 2 people who are to answer for the murder of Richards. Frater and Lamar, under count 7 of the indictment, are charged with facilitating the commission of a serious offense by a criminal organization. On Thursday, a witness, the first eyewitness to the incident, described the pandemonium that unfolded during the incident, which claimed the life of the 28-year-old, whom he said he had known from their childhood days. According to the eyewitness, he was some yards away from the fated spot when he heard explosions, gunshots, boom, 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 boom. The witness, who described seeing a lot of men running in different directions, said some slide and drop and them get up back and them run because gunshot are beating them. A description which some of the accused appeared to find amusing, smiling, tugging at their lips. He said he saw Richards bringing up the rear and making a desperate run for his life. According to this report, some of the 24 accused who sit in the court or in the docks, they were laughing or smiling when the witness said, "Gunshot a beat and him say beer man a run." and them are running at all different direction, and some of them were sliding and some of them drop and them get up and run again. Speaking of the guy who got killed, Richards, he said, well, he was running behind the crowd, but he was running and limping. Explosions were going off randomly. Boom, 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 boom. I suddenly saw Richards just fall face down. The guy who was chasing him came and stood over him and then shoot him multiple times in his upper body and then run off, left him there, the eyewitness said. He said before the melee happened, the individuals, including Richards, they had just been hanging out there, having good times, holding up vibes as usual, under questions from the prosecutors leading the evidence as to how he was able to determine that Richards was the one who was being shot from the distance where he stood. The witness said, because I know him. I know him from him small, just like having a kid. You know him from a distance. I am familiar with his limping movements. He said after Richard fell, one of the attackers then stood over him and just kept on firing away. Bomb, 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 bomb. He said by this time, the other man, who had chased another segment of the crowd in the opposite direction, that guy came back and showed up, after which the two of them turned tail and run, disappearing from my sight. The witness, who ruefully told the courts that he was unable to see the faces of the two assailants clearly, said that he nonetheless went into his house and he dialed 119. But he said 911. In the United States of America, 911 is used. In Jamaica, it's 119. He further described for the courts how residents who had scampered for their lives then returned to the scene shortly after the attackers had ran off, and they attempted to save Richard's life by trying to resuscitate him. But it never worked out. He was on the ground, and them tried to put him in a car, and a lot of blood was just running out of him. The blood was just running out of him. So they eventually got him in after a hard struggle. Somebody bloody and slippery, a whole heap of blood. Recalling that Richards was then rushed to the hospital. The witness, who said he remained at the scene until cops arrived to process the scene, under cross-examination by defense attorney Kamar Richards, who represents Freighter, insisted that he would not know them if he saw them again, stating that he would walk right past them and don't even know says them, since he didn't actually see their facial features that night because it was nighttime and it was 9 years which have passed since. Boy, when the man described that people were running and sliding and bust out them slippers and drop and get up and run left them shoes and all these things, and how the gunshot was beaten in a random order, like bang and then bang, bang, bang and then bang, bang, bang. The man them laugh. The man them laugh. Boom, boom. Yo. Alright. So, I can't recall is the next one. The defense is now grilling a cop witness over his inconsistencies in this ongoing Klansman trial. Detective Constables, I can't recall, replies to questions about several elements of a home invasion by two alleged members of the Tesha Miller-led faction of the Klansman Gang on Monday drew skepticism from defense attorneys who chastised and chided him for recalling on the spur of the moment the expletive he used when ordering them out of his house, but he is like hesitant over how many rounds of ammunition he handed over to the Independent Commission of Investigation after the encounter. So you remember the bad word where you use, but you don't remember how many rounds of ammunition you handed over to Indicom. The detective constable, who is the 10th prosecution witness in the ongoing trial of 25 alleged members of the gang in the Home Circuit Division of the Supreme Court in downtown Kingston, is also the victim of a February 27, 2020 incident in which the accused, Sharn Gilzine and Michael Wildman, are charged for shooting with intent on the count 18 of the 32-count indictment that is brought by the Crown. According to the cop, who is a 27-year veteran of the constabulary force, the encounter happened following his return from a St. Andrew school with his daughter and an exchange student from Canada who was to spend time with their family. The cop said that upon returning to his then home at the St. Catherine address, he allowed the children to enter the dwelling first while he removed the luggage from his personal vehicle. He told the courts that upon settling his visitor in and returning to the living room of his home, he saw the curtain move and two males came into his house armed. One of them had a smirk on his face and he said, "Nobody move." I observed that they had firearms in their right hands, both of them, the cop said, noting that the pistols looked similar to the ones that I carry. According to the lawman, while pulling his service pistol, he ordered them to come out of my bumbleclot house. Could you imagine you just come home with a foreign exchange student and gunman walk up in your house as you are unloading the foreign exchange student's luggage from your trunk and getting your guest settled into your house? He claimed that when he said this, that one of the would-be assailants pushed the other one and she ran. His recollection eliciting chuckles from several of the accused who paid sharp attention to what he was saying. He said one of them, when he said, "Come out of my bumbleclot house," one of them would-be assailants pushed the other one and she run. I don't know if he's calling the man them she or if there was a she there. But again, it is said that the accused men found this rather funny. Wow. He said that they ran through the glass door. I tactically moved towards where they ran. They were retreating, but they were pointing their firearms in the direction that I was in still. They were going through the grill at the carport at that time. Seeing them pointed in my direction, I opened fire at them, and they ran through the outer gates and turned right, and I decided that I was going to pursue them. He told the acting assistant director of public prosecution, marshalling the evidence. He said that while taking cover, he pursued the men and he fired at them at intervals until they entered a white sedan and they drove off very fast and they made their good escape. He said the entire episode was over in about 3 minutes. The cop, who said that he did not attend an identification parade to point out the men, asked to describe them, said that one had a bleached out appearance. He was very slim. He was about 5'8" or so tall, and he was in his mid to late 20s, while the other one wore a white t-shirt and he was about the same height. Defense attorney Abina Morris, who represents the accused, Gilzine, in cross-examination, in cross-examining the cop, wanted to know how many rounds of ammunition he had when he reported for work that day. Then he indicated he had 26. The attorney went on to ask whether anything else had occurred that day which resulted in him having to discharge his firearm. He answered and said, "I can't recall." "Can you recall how many rounds you had left at the end of the day?" the attorney said. The cop answered again, "I don't recall." Asked whether he wanted to refresh his memory by reading over his statement which he gave to the police following the incident, the cop said yes, and after reading that area of the statement twice, still could not reply, but was saved from doing so following an objection from the prosecution, which argued that the way the question was posed was very unfair. Morris, in retracting, then asked the lawman whether he had handed over his firearm and the remaining ammunition to Indicom and how many rounds were turned over. The lawman said, "I fired 4. "I didn't ask you how many you fired," the attorney said. "I asked you a direct question. How many rounds did you hand in along with your firearm?" I refreshed my memory. The magazine had 14 rounds, and I fired 4. So that means I am counting or accounting for 10, the cop said, only to have a dissatisfied Morris attorney state, "I didn't ask you about the magazine. I asked you how many rounds." It could be 24. If my memory serves me right. Again, evoked laughter from the accused people who could be seen conferencing with each other about the lawman's testimony. The lawman does not remember if it was 14 or 24 or 26 or how many he fired or how many he gave out back to Indicom. Those chuckles only grew louder and louder when the lawman, the police officer, some minutes later, still under persistent questioning from Morris. Remember, Morris is an attorney who is representing the accused men. While the lawman was being grilled, the police officer, the lawman said, "I made a mistake. It would be 13 in the magazine. If I fired 4, it would leave 9. So 9 and 13 is 22. Oh my God. So we went from 26 to 14, to 24 to 10 to 13, to 22, to 14 to 22. Of course, those accused in the courtroom found this extra funny and started to laugh loud. Those chuckles grew even louder. Asked whether he had told cops that when he checked his pistol after the incident, he said 10 9mm cartridges. The cop said, "Could be mistake. 10 9mm cartridges would be, a cartridge is considered a magazine. So he should have said 10 9mm rounds." So this police officer right here got all twisted up, challenged again by the attorney Morris as to how he made no mention in his statement of telling the men to leave his bomber-cloth house, but he could tell the courts on Monday, yes, he said, because I just remembered. You never said that before. After 6 years and you don't remember the count of the amount of rounds that you had, you all of a sudden remember that you did tell them bravely to leave your bumbleclot house? I guess mistakes do happen, right? Defense attorney Paul Gentles, in further picking apart the detective constable's evidence, attempted to cast doubt over his account of how many guns were in play and the span of time over which the shooting happened, especially after those questions were met with more "I can't recall" responses. They started calling this constable "I can't recall." Confronting the cop about his switching up his statement from telling the police in the days following the incident that he would be able to identify the men if he saw them again, to now saying he cannot recall their faces, wouldn't you agree to me that that part of your statement wasn't true? 6 years after. I can't identify them, the cop said. 6 years after. To which the attorney said, "You're very good. I'm suggesting to you that you are not a truthful witness." The police officer said, "I disagree with you. I am speaking the truth." And then the case will continue. This case is getting so interesting because the police officers who are involved in this case are cracking under cross-examination. I don't know if it's the pressures of how good these attorneys are, but it seems like they just cannot keep up with the powers of these attorneys, the style of these attorneys, the expertise of these attorneys. Now, to get to the final piece now, for those of you who have listened all along, here is the final piece. A 22-year veteran police officer formerly assigned to the now disbanded Counterterrorism and Organization Crime, or CTOC branch, was closely cross-examined yesterday in the ongoing Klansman Gang trial, where alleged gang leader Tesha Miller and 24 others are charged under the anti-gang legislation. The detective, now assigned to the Specialized Investigation Branch, or SIB, told the courts that on September 26th of 2018, he led an intelligence-driven operation in the Crossroads area targeting what police believed to be a robbery. He described the day in question as bright and sunny, as members of his team saturated the vicinity near the post office, uncertain who would carry out the crime. According to the officer, police observed a man at the location whom he said had been previously profiled in connection with robberies. The man was walking with another man, but when the former man saw him, he immediately turned around but was later intercepted. The motor vehicle was parked at the taxi stand. That motor vehicle was also stopped, and its driver also was taken into custody. All three of the men were detained. A motor vehicle that was parked at the taxi stand was also stopped. A fourth man, the officer said, was taken into custody sometime after that. The detective told prosecutors that none of the men were armed when searched, and none of them was charged on that day of the operation. However, he said statements were recorded from them for intelligence purposes based on utterances that they allegedly made while they were at the location. During his evidence in chief, he said he instructed a female member of the team to record these statements. "I had no evidence to prove or disprove their involvement," the officer said, admittingly. explaining that the statements were placed in a file jacket and they were stored in a drawer until he later received a request from another policeman. Under cross-examination by defense attorney John Clark, the veteran officer faced sustained questioning about record keeping and police procedures. He agreed the September 26 operation was planned and that a briefing was conducted at the SeaTalk base where he said he was one of the officers in charge. However, when pressed, he admitted that he could not recall the exact date that he handed over the files containing the statements, nor had he recorded that date anywhere else. He also said that he could not remember the exact date that the men were released from custody either. The court was briefly adjourned to allow the witness to retrieve the file jacket at his office after Clark demanded him be more specific. When proceedings resumed, the officer said that the statement from one of the men had been taken on October 2nd of 2018, 6 days after the September 26 operation. So were they in custody for 6 days before you even took a statement from them, holding them locked up under suspicion of thinking or planning to commit a crime but never catching them actually committing a crime? Then what were they in there for all those days for? Clark reminded the police officer that the men had been detained on September 26th, the same day of your operation. The officer reaffirmed that he was part of the initial team that took them into custody. Asked whether he was the one who caused the men to be detained, the inspector replied, no, and said that he could not recall who made that decision. Clark suggested that the men had been taken into custody on suspicions of robbery. Initially, I would agree, the officer responded and said, later clarifying that the men were brought into custody in relation to the operation that he led. So was it robbery or the operation you led? The defense further established that after the men gave statements in relation to September 26, all of them were not charged, a point the officer conceded, saying, not to my knowledge. Clark then drilled into the nature of the statements that were recorded. Asked to explain the difference between a caution statement and a witness statement, the detective said, a caution statement is taken from a suspect, must be witnessed by a justice of the peace or an attorney. In contrast, a witness statement is not usually required to be witnessed by a lawyer or justice of the peace. That was the police officer's explanation. He reiterated to the courts that he was not present when the statements were recorded and he could not say if the men's rights were violated. Very interesting. Clark, the attorney, defense, also put it to the officer that no offense had been committed at the scene, correct? The inspector agreed. You're right. None of the men was found armed, right? And no offense was committed in the officer's presence either, right? The cop agreed. However, he maintained that based on utterances that were made at the location, the men were brought into custody. Where are those utterances? The attorney asked. Where are those utterances? I believe the utterances were in the statements recorded from them, the police officer said. Mind you, the police officer said he was not there when the recording was made, but he believes that the utterances, which is the reason why they were brought into custody, were in the utterances that were recorded. Adding that he had sight of the statements after they were taken, not while they were being recorded. Further questioning probed at what stage the decision was made to formally detain these men and on what legal basis, as the defense continued to attempt to test the reliability and procedural integrity of the operation. The detective inspector is expected to return to the witness stand when the trial resumes at 10 a.m. today, February 27th, 2026. Very interesting how a good attorney can make a difference. If anybody is asking me what I think that a lot of these guys, out of the 25 of them, the 24 of them, are going to walk in this trial. Maybe they'll be able to get a conviction on some of them, but a lot of them are going to walk this out. Reason being, as you can see right there, clearly tells you that these guys were targeted, that they were arrested, that they were held in confinement for days on end. And it wasn't until 6 days after they were locked up that they were questioned. And then no charges were filed, and the date that they were released is still unknown, but we know what day they were taken into custody, with apparently no reason to have taken them into custody. So this kind of looks bad on the Jamaica Constabulary Force. As much as they want to find these guys guilty, whatever statements and evidence they are presenting to the courts is taking a serious beatdown by these attorneys who are defending them. This is the continuation of the Klansman Gang trial, and we will continue to follow it. Actually, this is not the Klansman Gang trial. I stay corrected. This is the Klansman Tesha Miller trial. We covered the Klansman Gang trial last year and the year before when that trial was in action. This year is the Klansman trial with Tesha Miller being a part of it. Stay tuned. Stay close. Hit that subscribe button. Hit the bell next to the subscribe button so you're noted and notified every time we upload a new video, or specifically when the update to this and the follow-up continues. There are going to be some very interesting stories to tell that will be revealed. Wait till they unveil who these two witnesses are. Wait till these two witnesses start actually telling everything else. I'm not saying they're lying. I'm not saying they're telling the truth. Some people do make up stories to save themselves. When you're looking at a life sentence versus a small sentence, people tend to do what they have to do to make it a small sentence instead of a life in prison sentence. So, however they spin these stories, it's going to be interesting for us who are sitting on the outside to have a look into this gangster life that people sing about, rap about, talk about, but most of us have never lived. Vicariously, we'll be able to walk through. So stay tuned. Leave your comments in the comment section below, and I'll catch you on the next video. It's SouFLoTV. I'm out. Peace.